She is Anne Boleyn. To history, she is a headline. She is Anne of the Thousand Days. She is the reason England is Protestant. She is the mother of Elizabeth I. But on the morning she climbed the scaffold, she was just a cast-aside wife looking for a husband who wasn't there. Henry VIII, the man who wrote her hundreds of passionate love letters, was miles away, reportedly dressing for the hunt, impatiently waiting for the cannon fire, signaling her death so he could uncouple the hounds. Even facing death, she didn't beg. She maintained a terrifying composure. They accused her of sleeping with her brother just to speed up the paperwork. The truth was much colder. She was destroyed for total erasure. Henry wanted a new wife immediately, and by accusing Anne of incest, he ensured her daughter Elizabeth would be deemed a product of sin, removed from the line of succession. She had become an expired asset, and for a ruthless king, an axe was just a quicker, cheaper alternative to a lawyer. The England of the early 16th century was not the stable, mighty empire we imagine today. It was a country recovering from trauma. For decades, the Wars of the Roses had bled the land dry. Brother had fought brother, and kings had been butchered on muddy fields. The Tudor dynasty, led by Henry VIII, was new. It was shiny, but it was brittle. Henry VIII began his reign as a golden prince. He was 6 feet tall, athletic, handsome, and intellectual, a Renaissance man in every sense. He was the sun around which the entire galaxy of the English court revolved. But deep down, there was a kernel of fear in Henry's heart. He knew that without a son, a legitimate male heir, the moment he died, the knives would come out. England would plunge back into civil war. For years, Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess of immense dignity, a daughter of warrior monarchs. The people loved her. She was pious, she was loyal, and she was royal blood. But the royal nursery was silent. The cradles were empty. Son after son had been born, only to die within days or weeks. It was a tragedy that slowly calcified into a political crisis. Only one child survived, a daughter, Mary. In Henry's mind, and in the minds of his advisors, a girl could not rule England. A queen regnant was unnatural. It would lead to chaos. Henry began to believe that his marriage was cursed by God. He began to look at Leviticus in the Bible, convinced that because Catherine had briefly been married to his dead brother Arthur, he was living in sin. The king was anxious. The court was tense. The atmosphere was one of desperate ambition and religious upheaval. And into this powder keg walked the Boleyns. Anne was not born into royalty. She was born into the striving class. The Boleyns were an old Norfolk family, respectable but not grand. However, they had something more valuable than ancient blood. They had an insatiable hunger for advancement. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was the architect of the family's rise. He was not a man content to sit in the countryside and count his sheep. He was a diplomat, a linguist, and a man who understood that in the Tudor court, you were either climbing or you were falling. There was no middle ground. He wanted power, and he knew the currency of power was proximity to the king. Anne was born at the family seat, Hever Castle in Kent, likely around the year 1501, though the records are so sparse that historians still argue over the date. Hever was a comfortable place surrounded by a double moat, nestled in the green garden of England. But Thomas Boleyn had no intention of letting his daughters, Mary and Anne, become mere country wives. He saw them as dynastic assets. In the ruthless chess game of politics, intelligent and beautiful daughters were pieces to be moved across the board to secure alliances. While other English girls of her station were learning needlepoint, making jams, and preparing to run a household, Thomas Boleyn had a different vision for Anne. He recognized early on that she possessed a sharp mind. She was quick-witted, observant, and had a spark in her dark eyes that hinted at a formidable intelligence. He decided to cultivate her talents abroad. This is the crucial turning point in Anne's life, the moment that separated her from every other woman at the English court. She was sent away to be educated on the continent. This was rare. This was a privilege usually reserved for the highest nobility. In 1513, when she was barely an adolescent, she was sent to the Netherlands to join the court of Margaret of Austria. Margaret was the regent of the Netherlands, ruling on behalf of her father, the Holy Roman Emperor. Imagine the culture shock for a young girl from Kent. The court at Mechlin was one of the most sophisticated artistic and intellectual centers in the known world. Margaret of Austria was a formidable woman, a female ruler in a man's world who commanded absolute respect. She was a patron of the arts, a politician, and a scholar. For young Anne, this was a revelation. She saw for the first time that a woman could hold power. She saw that a woman could be more than just a breeder of heirs. She could be a ruler. Anne thrived here. She was bright and eager to please. Margaret of Austria was so charmed by the young English girl that she famously wrote to Thomas Boleyn, calling Anne la petite Boleyn, the little Boleyn. She noted that Anne was so bright and pleasant for her young age that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you are to me. In Mechlin, Anne learned the basics of court etiquette. She learned that how you walked, how you held your hands, and how you lowered your eyes were not just manners, they were a language. She learned French, the universal language of diplomacy. She was polished like a rough diamond being prepared for a setting. But her education was not finished. The Netherlands was just the finishing school. France would be the university. In 1514, political winds shifted. Thomas Boleyn arranged for Anne to transfer to the French court to serve Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, who was marrying the elderly French king Louis XII. When Louis died shortly after and Mary returned to England, Anne stayed behind. She entered the service of the new Queen of France, Claude. For the next 7 years, Anne Boleyn lived at the very heart of the French Renaissance. This period is the key to unlocking her character. France was everything, England was not. The court of King Francis I was a whirlwind of hedonism, art, philosophy, and scandal. It was cultured, it was dangerous, and it was sexually charged. Queen Claude was a pious, gentle woman who spent much of her time pregnant, but the court around her was electric. Anne became a fluent French speaker, so fluent that people later said she seemed more French than English, but she learned more than just the language. She learned the French mindset. She learned fashion. She adopted the French hood, which exposed the hair and framed the face, rejecting the stifling gable hood headdresses popular in England that made women look like nuns. She learned to dress with a flair that was provocative yet elegant. She learned music and dance. She became an accomplished lute player and a singer. But more importantly, she learned the art of conversation. In England, women were expected to be seen and not heard. In France, a woman was expected to be witty. She was expected to hold her own in a debate, to make double entendre, to tease and to charm. It was here that Anne mastered the game of courtly love. In the French tradition, romance was a highly stylized game. It wasn't about immediate consummation. It was about the chase. It was about the man declaring his undying misery and the woman playing the elusive, cruel mistress. It was a dance of power. The woman held the cards. She distributed her favors, a ribbon, a smile, a glove, sparingly. Anne learned that by withholding herself, she increased her value. She learned that men wanted what they could not easily have. But there was a deeper, more dangerous current running through the French court, one that would eventually lead Anne to her doom. While serving Queen Claude, Anne also came into contact with the circle of Marguerite de Navarre, the king's sister. Marguerite was a brilliant intellectual and a patron of the new religion. Europe was on the brink of the Reformation. Martin Luther had nailed his theses to the church door. Ideas were spreading like a virus, dangerous, seditious ideas. Men were whispering that the Pope was corrupt. They were saying that the Catholic Church was hoarding the truth. They argued that ordinary people should be able to read the Bible in their own language, not just Latin. In Marguerite's salon, Anne was exposed to these evangelical ideas. She read the Bible in French. She heard debates about the nature of the soul and the authority of the king versus the authority of the Pope. This was radical stuff. For a young woman to be interested in theology was unusual. For her to be interested in heretical theology was dangerous. But Anne had an inquisitive mind. She absorbed these ideas. She began to believe that faith was a personal matter between the individual and God. She began to see the corruption of the clergy with clear eyes. By the time she was recalled to England in 1522, Anne Boleyn was a completely different creature from the girl who had left Hever Castle. She was 21 years old. She was sophisticated, fashionable, and intellectually sharp. She was a carrier of the Renaissance virus. She wasn't a classic beauty by the standards of the time. The ideal beauty in the 16th century was a pale, blonde, blue-eyed English rose. Anne had a swarthy olive complexion. Her hair was dark, almost black. Her eyes were her most striking feature, black and beautiful, as contemporaries described them, and she knew how to use them to devastating effect. She had a long, elegant neck and a slender, flat-chested figure. Some at the English court whispered that she looked strange. She looked foreign. She looked exotic. When Anne stepped off the boat and returned to English soil in 1522, the contrast must have been jarring. The English court, compared to France, felt provincial. It was damper, darker, and less refined. The men were rowdier. The fashion was outdated. She had been brought back for a specific purpose. Her father wanted to marry her off to James Butler, an Irish cousin, to settle a dispute over the earldom of Ormond. It was a practical, unromantic arrangement. Anne, fresh from the palaces of the Loire Valley, must have viewed the prospect of living in wild Ireland with absolute horror. Fortunately for her, the marriage negotiations stalled. This left Anne at the English court, serving Queen Catherine of Aragon as a maid of honor. She wasted no time in making an impression. On March 4th, 1522, Anne made her public debut at a court pageant called the Chateau Vert, the Green Castle. The pageant was an elaborate play where the ladies of the court pretended to be virtues residing in a castle, and the men had to assault the fortress. Anne was cast in the role of Perseverance. It was a prophetic choice. She appeared in a gown of white satin embroidered with gold. She danced with a grace and fluidity that the English courtiers had never seen. She stood out. She didn't blend in with the other maids of honor. She had a presence, a magnetism that drew eyes to her. Among the men watching the pageant was King Henry VIII. But at this specific moment, the king was busy with his current mistress, Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn. Mary had been the kind Boleyn girl. She had given the king what he wanted without a fight. She had warmed his bed, borne him 2 children who were never acknowledged, and had been quietly set aside when the king's interest waned. She was a cautionary tale walking through the halls of the palace, a used woman with a ruined reputation. Anne watched her sister. She saw the humiliation. And somewhere, deep in her calculating mind, a steel door slammed shut. She looked at Mary's fate and made a silent vow that would change history. I will not be a mistress. I will not be used. If I play this game, I will play to win. With that silent vow locked away in her heart, Anne stepped out of the shadow of her sister's disgrace and into the dazzling, treacherous light of the English court. She was armed with French wit, dangerous ideas, and a steely resolve never to be a victim. But even the most calculated strategies can be derailed by the one variable Anne hadn't accounted for, her own heart. Before she would face the king, she would have to face a different kind of trial, a forbidden romance that would teach her just how cruel the game of power could truly be. The year was 1523. The English court was a place of pageantry and velvet whispers, but beneath the surface it was a pit of vipers. Anne Boleyn, fresh from the sophisticated salons of France, was now a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. She moved through the corridors with a peculiar grace, her French hood setting her apart from the sea of English gabled headdresses, her dark eyes observing everything. She was not yet the woman who would break the church. At this moment she was simply a young woman in love, and that love would be the first casualty in her education of power. While history remembers Anne as the woman who bewitched a king, her own heart initially beat for a man of her own station, Henry Percy. He was the heir to the earldom of Northumberland, a young man of immense wealth and future influence. He was part of the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the Lord Chancellor and the most powerful man in England, aside from the king himself. Anne and Percy met in the antechambers of the palace. It was a classic court romance. Stolen glances, whispered conversations while the queen played cards, hands brushing against each other during dances. It was passionate, and by all accounts it was sincere. They were young, they were well matched, and in their youthful naivety they made a secret pledge to marry. In the eyes of the church, a pre-contract like this was binding. They considered themselves husband and wife in spirit, if not yet in law. But they had forgotten the golden rule of the Tudor aristocracy. Marriage was not about love. It was about land, titles, and alliances, and they had certainly forgotten to ask permission. When Cardinal Wolsey discovered the secret betrothal, his wrath was biblical. He saw it as a disruption of his own political machinations. He summoned young Percy and humiliated him in front of the servants, calling him a proud, presumptuous, disdainful, and very unthrift boy. He threatened to disinherit him. But Wolsey didn't stop there. He sent for Anne's father. Sir Thomas Boleyn, ever the pragmatist, did not defend his daughter's heart. He sided with power. Anne was verbally lashed, the betrothal was forcibly broken, and Percy was quickly married off to a daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, a loveless match that would make him miserable for the rest of his life. Anne was banished. She was sent back to Hever Castle in disgrace. As she rode away from the court, leaving behind the man she loved, a seed of bitterness took root in her soul. She blamed Cardinal Wolsey for destroying her happiness. She saw him as the embodiment of clerical arrogance, a butcher's son who wore red silk and thought he could play God with people's lives. She reportedly swore vengeance. "If it ever lies in my power," she is said to have whispered, "I will work the cardinal as much displeasure as he has done to me." It was a lesson she would never forget. In this world, you are either the hammer or the anvil. If you do not hold power, you will be crushed by those who do. At Hever, wandering the gardens, Anne buried the romantic girl who believed in love. The woman who returned to court a few years later was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. It is unclear exactly when Henry VIII stopped seeing Anne as just another face in the crowd and started seeing her as an obsession. It likely happened around 1526. Henry was nearing his mid-30s. The golden shine of his youth was fading. He had gained weight. A jousting accident had left him with a painful, ulcerated leg that would plague him for life. But his biggest wound was invisible, the lack of a son. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had become a source of deep melancholy. She was 40 years old, past childbearing age. She had grown stout and pious, spending her days in prayer. Henry, a man of high vitality and libido, felt trapped. He had already taken Anne's sister Mary as a mistress. He had already fathered a bastard son, Henry Fitzroy, with another mistress, Bessie Blount. He was used to women being available. He was the king, God's anointed. To refuse him was not just rude, it was practically treasonous. When his eyes fell on the dark-haired, witty, elegant Anne Boleyn, he assumed the script would follow the usual path. He would send a gift. She would blush. He would invite her to his bed. She would accept. He would tire of her. She would be married off with a nice dowry. He sent her a brooch. He started engaging her in conversation, expecting her to be flattered. And then Anne Boleyn did the unthinkable. She stopped the script. This moment is the pivot point of English history. If Anne had said yes, she would have been a footnote, another mistress, another Mary Boleyn. But Anne looked at the king, and she looked at the wreckage of her sister's reputation. She knew that once a king possesses you, you lose your power. The moment you give in, you become a conquest, and conquests are soon forgotten. She employed the lessons of the French court. She played the game of courtly love, but she played it with a lethal seriousness. When Henry propositioned her, she dropped to her knees. Her response, recorded by contemporaries, was a masterpiece of diplomatic rejection. I beseech your highness most earnestly to desist and to recover your good graces, and in good time the love of some other. For though I am a creature of small account, I have but one jewel of price, and that is my maidenhead, well attested and certified. I would rather lose my life than my honesty. Henry was stunned. He tried to argue that he didn't want to ruin her honesty. He wanted to love her. Anne retorted, Your wife I cannot be, both in respect of mine own unworthiness and also because you have a queen already. Your mistress I will not be. Your mistress I will not be. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. She was betting her entire future that Henry's desire was stronger than his pride. She retreated to Hever Castle again, removing herself from his sight. Absence did not make Henry forget. It made him frantic. He was a man who had never been denied anything. The fact that he couldn't have her made him want her with a burning, consuming intensity. The chase was on. For the next 6 years, 6 long, agonizing years, Henry VIII pursued Anne Boleyn. We have the evidence of this obsession in the form of 17 love letters that miraculously survived. Ironically, they are now held in the Vatican Library. In these letters, we see a side of Henry that is shockingly vulnerable. The tyrant vanishes, replaced by a lovesick teenager. He struggles with his handwriting. He draws little hearts around her initials. He begs, I beseech you now with all my heart, definitely to let me know your whole mind as to the love between us, he wrote. If you please, to do the office of a true loyal mistress and friend, and to give up yourself body and heart to me, I promise you that not only the name shall be given you, but also that I will take you for my only mistress, casting off all others besides you out of my thoughts and affections, and serve you only. He was offering her the position of maître titre, official mistress, a recognized status in France but unknown in England. Anne's reply was silence or polite refusal. She sent him gifts, a diamond carved in the shape of a ship with a lonely damsel on board, symbolizing her precarious position. She kept him on the hook, reeling him in and then pushing him away, but slowly the dynamic shifted. Anne began to realize that Henry's dissatisfaction with his marriage was not just a passing mood, it was a deep dynastic crisis. She saw an opening. If she played this perfectly, she wouldn't just be a mistress. She could be queen. Anne was not just a pretty face. She was an intellectual partner. During those long years of courtship, She and Henry spent hours talking. They talked about theology, about politics, about the state of Europe. Anne began to carefully introduce Henry to the new learning, the Protestant ideas she had absorbed in France. She knew Henry was a devout Catholic. He had even been named Defender of the Faith by the Pope for writing a book against Martin Luther. But she also knew he loved power. One day, she handed him a banned book, The Obedience of a Christian Man by William Tyndale. This book was dangerous heresy. It argued that the king, not the Pope, should be the supreme authority over the souls of his subjects. It argued that the church had usurped the power of monarchs. Anne marked specific passages with her fingernail and handed it to Henry, saying, "This is a book for all kings to read." Henry read it, and the light bulb went on. "By the help of God," he reportedly said, "this is strictly true." It was the solution to all his problems. If the Pope had no authority, then the Pope could not tell him he couldn't divorce Catherine. If the king was the head of the church, the king could grant his own divorce. He could marry Anne. He could have a son. He could be rich with the church's money. Anne had handed him the key to his own cage. As Anne's influence grew, her old enemy, Cardinal Wolsey, began to panic. He had been trying to secure a divorce for Henry through the usual diplomatic channels in Rome, but the Pope was effectively a prisoner of Catherine of Aragon's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Pope could not grant the divorce without offending the emperor. The proceedings dragged on. A court was set up at Blackfriars in London to hear the case. Queen Catherine appeared and gave a speech of heart-wrenching dignity, kneeling at Henry's feet and swearing she had been a virgin when they married. The people cheered for her. The case collapsed. The Pope recalled the matter to Rome. Henry was furious. He needed someone to blame. Anne saw her chance. She and her faction, the Boleyns and the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, poisoned the king's ear against Wolsey. They whispered that Wolsey was delaying on purpose, that he was loyal to the Pope over the king. "He is the night crow," Anne reportedly called him. In 1529, the great cardinal fell. He was stripped of his titles and his wealth. York Place, his magnificent palace, was confiscated by the king and given to Anne, who would rename it Whitehall. Wolsey died on his way to face trial for treason. Anne had fulfilled her vow. She had destroyed the man who had crushed her first love. She was now the most powerful person in England after the king. With Wolsey gone, a new man stepped into the vacuum, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was a blacksmith's son, a mercenary, a lawyer, and a genius. He was a pragmatist who saw the world in terms of statutes and laws. Anne and Cromwell formed a formidable, albeit temporary, alliance. They had the same goal: break Rome. Cromwell drafted the legislation. Anne provided the will. Together they dismantled the English church brick by brick. They cut off the payments to Rome. They declared that the king was the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a revolution, and it was all being done for the sake of a woman. By 1532, the great matter was coming to a head. Henry was no longer hiding his intentions. He paraded Anne openly as his consort, treating Catherine of Aragon with cold cruelty, banishing her from court, and separating her from her daughter Mary. In September 1532, Henry bestowed upon Anne a singular honor. In a grand ceremony at Windsor Castle, she was created the Marquess of Pembroke. Note the title, not Marchioness, but Marquess. It was a male title. It carried with it lands, wealth, and status in her own right. It was Henry's way of saying that she was no longer a commoner. She was nobility equal to the highest peers in the realm. During the ceremony, she wore a crimson velvet robe lined with ermine and a coronet of gold. She accepted the patent of nobility from the king's hands. It was the dress rehearsal for the crown. In October 1532, Henry and Anne traveled to Calais, which was then English territory, for a diplomatic summit with the King of France. Henry wanted Francis I to publicly support his new marriage. It was a dazzling display of wealth. The Field of the Cloth of Gold was recreated in spirit. Anne, now the Marquis of Pembroke, acted as the king's partner. She danced with the King of France. She was treated as a queen in all but name. And it was there, in the heady atmosphere of international diplomacy and triumph, that the walls finally came down. After 6 or 7 years of resistance, Anne Boleyn finally allowed Henry VIII into her bed. Why then? Perhaps she felt secure enough. Perhaps she knew that the point of no return had been crossed. Or perhaps more practically, she knew that to seal the deal she needed to be pregnant. A pregnancy would force the issue. If she carried the king's son, no one could deny their marriage. They returned to England in a winter storm, but their spirits were high. By December, Anne knew, her courses had stopped. She was with child. The clock was now ticking loudly. A child born out of wedlock would be a bastard, unable to inherit the throne. They had to marry, and they had to marry fast. On a cold morning, roughly January 25th, 1533, the exact date was kept secret for a long time. A small group gathered in a private chapel at Whitehall Palace. It was a clandestine affair. A priest, likely Dr. Roland Lee, performed the ceremony. It was quick. It was quiet. There were no choirs, no crowds, no public acclamations, just a man, a woman, and a handful of witnesses holding their breath. In that shadowed room, Anne Boleyn became the Queen of England. She had done it. She had climbed from the position of a minor knight's daughter to the throne of the Tudors. She had bested a Spanish princess, a cardinal, and the Pope himself. She touched her stomach. She was certain, with the fierce certainty of the ambitious, that she carried the boy who would save England. The astrologers had told her so. The doctors had told her so. God surely was on her side. The deed was done. The secret was sealed in that private chapel, and the gamble of a lifetime had been made. But a marriage in the shadows is one thing, a queen in the daylight is another. As the winter of 1533 turned to spring, the doors of the palace were thrown open, and the great matter was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. Anne Boleyn was about to step onto the world stage, crowned and pregnant, expecting adulation. Instead, she was about to discover that wearing the crown is infinitely harder than winning it. The spring of 1533 was a season of holding breath. The English court was walking a tightrope over a canyon of treason and heresy. Henry VIII had broken with 1,000 years of history to marry Anne Boleyn, and now the world waited to see if the gamble would pay off. Anne was no longer the Marquess of Pembroke. She was the queen, but she was a queen in a hostile land. The nobility bowed to her face but sneered behind her back. The common people, loyal to the cast-aside Catherine of Aragon, were less subtle. They called her the concubine, the goggle-eyed whore, and the scandal of Christendom. But Anne did not care. She had the king, she had the crown, and most importantly, she had the swollen belly that she believed contained the future King of England. She adopted a new motto, embroidered on her servant's livery in silver thread, the most happy. It was a defiant scream to the universe. She was happy. She had won. But as the Greeks knew, hubris, that overwhelming pride, is always followed by nemesis. Henry was determined to legitimize his new wife with a coronation that would outshine any that had come before. He wanted to force the people to accept her through the sheer weight of spectacle. On May 31st, 1533, the coronation procession began. Anne, dressed in white cloth of gold, sat in a litter draped in white satin. Her long dark hair, usually tucked under a hood, hung loose down her back, a symbol of virginity and purity, a visual argument against the claims that she was a harlot. The procession moved from the Tower of London to Westminster. The city was draped in velvet and gold arras. Fountains ran with free wine, but the atmosphere was wrong. The crowds that lined the muddy streets of London were sullen. There were no cheers of "God Save the Queen." There was a heavy, resentful silence. Caps were not doffed. Heads were not bowed. When the royal entourage passed, the silence was so profound, it was insulting. At one point, the royal monogram, the intertwined letters H and A for Henry and Anne, was displayed on banners and arches. The Londoners, with their biting Cockney wit, pointed at the letters and laughed. "Ha, ha," they jeered. The king's romance was a joke. Henry was furious. Anne, however, held her head high. She smiled at the silent crowd with a composure that was almost terrifying. She refused to let them see her bleed. On June 1st, inside Westminster Abbey, the moment of triumph arrived. In a break with tradition that shocked the clergy, Anne was crowned not with the smaller consort's crown, but with St. Edward's crown, the heavy, solid gold crown of the monarch. It was Henry's way of saying that she was not just a wife, she was his equal, his partner, his queen by divine right. She sat on the throne, the heavy gold pressing down on her brow, 6 months pregnant, ruling a court that hated her. She was at the zenith of her power. The summer of 1533 was spent in a fever of anticipation. The doctors were unanimous. The baby was a boy. The astrologers had cast the charts and confirmed it. A prince was coming. Henry was so certain that he had the official birth announcement letters written in advance, leaving a blank space for the word prince. A magnificent tournament was planned to celebrate the heir. The royal nursery at Greenwich Palace was refurbished with the finest tapestries. Henry felt vindicated. This boy would prove that God had blessed his new marriage and that the curse of Catherine of Aragon was lifted. On the afternoon of September 7th, 1533, Anne went into labor. The court waited. The cannons at the tower were primed to fire the salute, and then the cry of a baby echoed through the chamber. It was a healthy baby. It had red hair, like the king. It had long fingers, like the mother. It was strong and vigorous, but it was a girl. The silence that followed must have been deafening. The shock was absolute. The word prince on the announcement letters had to be hastily corrected to princess, princess. The extra S squeezed in awkwardly, a grammatical symbol of the king's crushing disappointment. The tournament was canceled. The bonfires were doused. Henry refused to attend the christening. He felt betrayed by God, by the stars, and perhaps irrationally by Anne. They named the child Elizabeth, after Henry's mother. No one looked at that red-headed infant and saw the greatest monarch in English history. They saw only a failure. They saw another girl in a dynasty desperate for a man. For Anne, the birth of Elizabeth was the first crack in the ice. She had promised Henry a son. She had failed. The witchcraft of her charm began to wear thin against the cold reality of dynastic biology. With the chase over and the prize won, the dynamic between Henry and Anne shifted violently. Henry was a man who enjoyed the pursuit. He liked the game of courtly love, the elusive mistress, the witty banter. But now he wanted a wife, and in the 16th century, a wife's job was to be submissive, quiet, and agreeable. She was supposed to be a harbor of peace for the king. Anne Boleyn was incapable of being a harbor of peace. She was a storm. She remained the same woman Henry had fallen in love with, opinionated, sharp-tongued, jealous, and politically active. She shouted at him when he looked at other women. She mocked his clothes. She argued with him about religion and foreign policy. In the courtship, this fire had been exciting. In marriage, Henry found it exhausting. He famously complained to the imperial ambassador that Anne was shrewish. The sexual tension that had fueled their relationship turned into sexual frustration. Henry, whose eye was always wandering, began to take mistresses again. When Anne raged about this, Henry delivered a chilling rebuke. He told her to shut her eyes and endure it, as her betters had done before her, reminding her brutally that she had been elevated from nothing and could be lowered just as easily. It was a terrifying threat. I made you. I can unmake you. Despite the tension, Anne was not idle. She knew her position was precarious, so she worked to solidify her power through religion. She became the patron saint of the English Reformation. This is the side of Anne often forgotten in the soap opera of her death. She was a serious political player. She used her influence to appoint evangelical bishops, including Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. She protected heretics from the fires of the conservative clergy. She placed an English Bible in her chambers for her ladies to read, a radical act in a time when reading scripture in the vernacular was considered subversive. She famously possessed a copy of the Psalms translated into English, hidden in a velvet binding. Anne believed she was doing God's work. She believed she was purifying the church from the corruption of Rome, but this zeal made her dangerous enemies. The conservative faction at court, led by the Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, and Bishop Gardiner, hated her. They saw her as a Lutheran heretic, a poison in the ear of the king. They began to whisper that the king had been seduced by black magic. How else could one explain the rise of this dark, skinny woman over the pious Spanish queen, even though she was crowned? Anne was never truly safe as long as Catherine of Aragon was alive. Catherine, exiled to damp castles in the countryside, refused to accept the divorce. She signed her letters, Catherine the Queen, England. She was a living martyr, a rallying point for everyone who hated Anne. The tension transferred to the children. Henry declared his daughter, with Catherine Mary, to be a bastard. She was stripped of the title princess and referred to simply as the Lady Mary. In a final act of spite, Anne demanded that Mary be sent to serve as a maid to the infant Elizabeth. It was a humiliation designed to break the girl's spirit. Mary, possessing the stubbornness of the Tudors and the pride of Spain, refused to acknowledge Anne as queen. Anne was terrified of Mary. She knew that if Henry died, the people would rally to Mary, not Elizabeth. Anne famously said, "She is my death, and I am hers." It was a chillingly accurate prediction. The years 1534 and 1535 passed in a blur of anxiety. Anne was pregnant again in 1534, but it ended in a miscarriage, possibly kept secret to avoid public embarrassment. The pressure was mounting. Henry was aging. His leg was ulcerating, causing him constant pain and foul moods. Then came 1536, the year that would run red with blood. It began with death. On January 7th, 1536, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle. When the news reached London, Henry and Anne did something that shocked the court. They dressed in yellow. To the English, it was the color of joy, a celebration that the old harridan was dead. But to the Spanish and to many in the court who sympathized with Catherine, yellow was the color of royal mourning. It was a gesture that could be read two ways, as a final act of respect or as a cruel, dazzling mockery. Anne should have felt relieved. Her rival was gone, but in reality, Catherine had been her shield. While Catherine was alive, Henry could not divorce Anne without admitting he was wrong, effectively saying, "I shouldn't have left Catherine." That would mean going back to her, which his pride would never allow. But with Catherine dead, the slate was wiped clean. Henry was a widower. He was free to marry anyone. He didn't have to stay with Anne. And Henry already had someone in mind. Her name was Jane Seymour. She was everything Anne was not. Where Anne was dark, Jane was pale. Where Anne was witty and loud, Jane was silent and outwardly submissive. But this was not the silence of stupidity. It was the silence of strategy. Jane's motto was bound to obey and serve. It was a calculated humility that soothed Henry's tired ears. He was sick of the drama. He was sick of the intellectual debates. He wanted a wife who would sit quietly, agree with him, and give him a son. The Seymours, sensing the king's interest, began to coach Jane just as the Boleyns had coached Anne. "Don't give in to him," they whispered. "Make him marry you." History was repeating itself. Anne watched with horror as the king began to play the same game with Jane that he had played with her. The gifts, the glances, the innocent walks in the garden. On January 24th, 1536, disaster struck. Henry was jousting at Greenwich. He was 44 years old, heavy, and dressed in full armor. He was thundering down the lists on a massive armored war horse. Suddenly, the king's horse stumbled. It fell, and the king fell with it. The horse, wearing steel plating, rolled over on top of Henry. The court screamed. The king lay motionless in the mud. He was unconscious for 2 hours. Many historians and neurologists today believe this accident caused a significant brain injury, damage to the frontal lobe. Before this accident, Henry could be cruel, but he was generally rational. After this accident, he became paranoid, impulsive, and terrifyingly erratic. His headaches worsened, his patience evaporated. Anne was told the news that the king was dead. She collapsed. The shock was immense. Henry survived, but he woke up a different man, and the shock had done terrible damage to the queen. 5 days later, on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, Anne Boleyn went into premature labor. She was roughly 3.5 months pregnant. It was a boy. The midwives wept. It was the savior of the dynasty, the son Henry had waited 27 years for, and he was born dead. When Henry walked into the room, he did not offer comfort. He looked at the weeping woman and the bloody sheets. He looked at the tiny, lifeless form of his son. His face was cold stone. "I see that God will not give me male children," he said. Anne, desperate and hysterical, tried to blame the miscarriage on him. She claimed it was the shock of hearing about his fall from the horse. She claimed it was the stress of seeing him flirt with Jane Seymour. Henry turned his back on her. "I will speak to you when you are well," he muttered, and walked out of the room. It was the end. In Henry's mind, the contract was void. He had married her for a son. She had failed. Worse, he began to believe that God was speaking to him. His first marriage had been cursed because no sons died. Now, his second marriage was producing dead sons. Therefore, the second marriage must also be a sin. Henry began to wonder, had he been tricked? Had he been seduced by spells? While Anne was never officially charged with witchcraft, the rumor that she had bewitched the king became a convenient narrative to explain his mistake. The door clicked shut behind the king, and with it, the last sliver of safety for Anne Boleyn vanished. The tragedy of the miscarriage was not just a personal loss, it was a political death sentence. While Anne wept for her lost son, the sharks in the council chamber smelled blood in the water. The king was vulnerable, angry, and looking for a way out. And in the shadows, Thomas Cromwell, the man who had built Anne's throne, began to quietly, methodically draw up the blueprints for her scaffold. April 1536 was a cruel month. The weather was turning warm, the gardens of Greenwich Palace were blooming, but inside the royal apartments the air was toxic with paranoia. King Henry VIII had withdrawn into himself. The Golden Prince was gone, replaced by a brooding, suspicious monarch who sat in dark rooms, nursing his ulcerated leg and his wounded pride. He had convinced himself that his marriage was a nullity, a trick played on him by the devil. He wanted out, but he didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to be the victim. He needed to believe that he was the one who had been wronged, that Anne was the villain. Thomas Cromwell, the king's master secretary, understood this better than anyone. He knew that if he merely arranged a divorce, Anne would remain the Dowager Marchioness of Pembroke. She would be alive. She would be angry. And she would have influence through her daughter, Elizabeth. If Cromwell failed to destroy her completely, she would eventually destroy him. It was a kill or be killed scenario. Cromwell chose to kill. While the wolves were circling, Anne made a catastrophic mistake. Her nerves were frayed. She was recovering from the miscarriage, terrified of losing her status and desperate for reassurance. She began to act recklessly. In late April, she had a conversation with Henry Norris. Norris was the groom of the stool, the king's closest personal friend and servant. He was a man of high honor, wealthy, and respected. Anne, in a moment of frantic flirtation, asked Norris why he hadn't married his fiancée yet. Norris replied that he would tarry a while. Anne snapped back, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." The room must have frozen. In Tudor England, imagining the king's death was treason. To speak of it was a capital crime. Anne had just accused the king's best friend of waiting for Henry to die so he could marry the queen. Norris, horrified, dropped to his knees. He told her to take back her words. He knew that if that sentence reached the king's ears, they were both dead. Anne, realizing her mistake, tried to play it off, but the damage was done. The walls had ears. Cromwell's spies were everywhere. This slip of the tongue was the spark Cromwell needed. Cromwell needed a confession. He knew he wouldn't get one from a nobleman like Norris, who would die before dishonoring himself. So Cromwell looked lower. He fixed his gaze on Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was a commoner, a musician in the Queen's household. He was talented, handsome, and proud, perhaps a little too proud for his station. He was often seen in the Queen's chambers, playing the lute and singing for her. On April 30th, 1536, Smeaton was invited to dine at Cromwell's house in Stepney. It was a trap. As soon as he arrived, the doors were locked. The questions began. "When did you sleep with the Queen?" Smeaton denied it. He was confused, then terrified. "We will never know exactly what happened in that room. The official records are silent on the methods used. But when Smeaton was taken to the Tower of London the next day, he was broken. Most historians believe he was brutally tortured. Pain has a way of extracting truth. Under agony, Smeaton confessed. Yes, he had slept with the Queen. Yes, 3 times. He provided the thread. Cromwell now had to weave the noose. May 1st, 1536. The traditional May Day tournament at Greenwich. The court was gathered in the viewing stands. King Henry and Queen Anne sat together in the royal box. To the observer, everything looked normal. Flags waved, horses snorted, knights charged down the lists. Henry Norris was one of the jousters. But the king was acting strangely. He was tense. He barely looked at his wife. Midway through the tournament, a messenger arrived and whispered something in the king's ear. It was the confirmation of Smeaton's confession. Henry stood up abruptly. He didn't say goodbye to the Queen. He didn't explain. He simply turned his back and walked out of the box, mounting his horse and riding back to London with a small entourage. Anne was left sitting there, alone in the royal box, the crowd staring at her. She must have felt the cold chill of the grave. She watched her husband ride away, and she would never see his face again. On the ride back, Henry questioned Henry Norris. He offered Norris a pardon if he confessed to adultery with the Queen. Norris, a man of integrity, refused. He swore on his soul that the Queen was innocent. Henry, in his paranoia, took this denial as proof of a deep conspiracy. Norris was arrested and sent to the Tower. The next morning, May 2nd, 1536, the hammer fell. Anne was watching a game of tennis at Greenwich when the king's counselors arrived. They informed her that she was to appear before the Privy Council. She was led into the council chamber. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was there. He was not a supportive relative. He was a ruthless survivor who saw Anne as a liability. He treated her with contempt, telling her that her paramours had confessed. Anne was stunned. She denied everything. She laughed in their faces, hysterical with shock. They told her she was under arrest. At 2 p.m., the tide on the Thames turned. A barge was waiting. It was the same barge that had carried her to her coronation 3 years earlier. The irony was suffocating. They rowed her up the river to the Tower of London. They did not take her through Traitor's Gate, the water gate usually reserved for prisoners, but to the private royal steps. When she stepped onto the wharf, she fell to her knees. "O Lord, help me, as I am guiltless of this whereof I am accused," she cried out. The constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, was there to receive her. He was a dry, bureaucratic man who would become her jailer and her chronicler. "Mr. Kingston," she asked, clutching his arm, "shall I go into a dungeon?" "No, madam," he replied. "You shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation." Anne burst into tears. "It is too good for me," she wept. Then, just as suddenly, she began to laugh. It was the laughter of a woman whose mind was fracturing under the strain. For the next 2 weeks, Anne was a prisoner in the royal apartments. Her mental state oscillated wildly. One moment she was calm and regal, preparing for death. The next she was manic, babbling about her innocence. She was not alone. Cromwell had placed female spies around her, women who hated her, including her own aunt, Lady Boleyn. They reported every sentence she spoke. Anne, in her distress, babbled incriminating things. She spoke about her conversations with Norris. She wondered aloud if Francis Weston, another young courtier, was in love with her. She mentioned William Brereton. She worried about her brother, George Boleyn. Cromwell used these ramblings. He arrested Weston, Brereton, and finally George Boleyn. To make sure the king could never ever take Anne back, Cromwell had to make the charges unforgivable. Adultery was bad. Treason was worse. But Cromwell went further. He accused Anne of incest. He claimed that she had slept with her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. This was the nuclear option. It painted Anne not just as a traitor, but as a moral monster, a deviant who had perverted the laws of nature. But the true purpose of this charge was dynastic. If Anne was a monster, then her daughter Elizabeth was the spawn of corruption. This charge would legally bastardize the child, clearing the way for Henry's future children. Monday, May 15th, 1536. The Great Hall of the Tower of London. A platform had been erected. On it sat 26 peers of the realm, the jury selected by Cromwell. They were men who owed their lives and titles to the king. The verdict was not in doubt. Presiding over the trial was the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle. Anne was led into the hall. She was dressed in black velvet. She looked exhausted, but she composed herself. She walked with the dignity of a queen. She curtsied to the peers. The indictment was read. It was a list of horrors. It accused her of seducing 5 men. It accused her of plotting the king's death. It accused her of laughing at the king's poetry and his clothes. Anne listened. When her turn came to speak, she did not scream. She did not beg. She systematically dismantled the charges. She spoke clearly and calmly. She made so wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, excusing herself with her words so clearly as though she had never been faulty to the same, wrote one witness. The crowd was impressed. For a moment it seemed she might win. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses, just the hearsay of a tortured musician and the ramblings of a terrified woman. But this was a show trial. Justice had nothing to do with it. The peers retired. They returned quickly. "Guilty," said the first peer. "Guilty," said the second. 26 times. The word echoed in the hall. "Guilty." The Duke of Norfolk, tears reportedly running down his face, pronounced the sentence, "Because thou hast offended our sovereign the king's grace in committing treason against his person, thou art adjudged to be burned here within the Tower of London on the Green, or to be beheaded, as the king's pleasure shall be further known. Burned or beheaded. The king would decide." Anne heard the sentence. She looked up. She did not look at her uncle. She looked at the ceiling, towards heaven. "O Father," she said, "O Creator, thou who art the way, the truth, and the life, thou knowest that I have not deserved this death." 2 days later, on May 17th, her brother George and the 4 other men, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton, were led to Tower Hill. George Boleyn made a brave speech. The axe fell 5 times. The heads were displayed on London Bridge. Anne was told they were dead. She took it as a sign. "They are the witnesses of my innocence," she said. "If I were guilty, surely one of them would have saved his life by confessing." She was alone now. The last of her circle was gone. She sat in her room, listening to the birds singing outside, waiting for the messenger who would tell her when she would die. But Henry had one final cruelty left to inflict. Before he killed her body, he wanted to destroy her soul. He wanted to annul the marriage. He wanted to declare that she had never been his wife and that Elizabeth was a bastard. To do this, he sent Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had once been Anne's ally, to visit her in the Tower. What happened in that room? What deal was made? We don't know. But the next day, the marriage was declared null and void. Think about the logic. She was condemned to death for adultery. But if the marriage was void from the start, she had never been the king's wife. Therefore, she could not have committed adultery. It didn't make sense, but it didn't have to. The king wanted her dead, and he wanted her erased. The legal dismantling of the queen was complete. She had been stripped of her title, her marriage, her reputation, and her friends. The parchment was signed, the verdict recorded. All that remained now was the final act of the tragedy. As the sun set on May 18th, the Tower of London fell silent, save for the sharpening of a blade. The dawn of May 19th, 1536, did not break with the warmth of spring. It broke with a gray, suffocating stillness. Inside the Tower of London, the woman who had been the most powerful female in England woke for the last time. She'd expected to die the day before, on the 18th. She had confessed her sins to her almoner, swearing on the Holy Sacrament, risking her eternal soul if she lied, that she was innocent of adultery. She had prepared herself, but the order had been delayed. The swordsman from Calais was late. This delay was a final, unintended psychological torture. "Mr. Kingston," she had said to her jailer, "I hear I shall not die before noon, and I am very sorry therefore, for I thought to be dead by this time, and past my pain." Kingston, a man who had seen many perish, tried to comfort her. "There should be no pain. It is so subtle," he told her, referring to the French sword. It was then that Anne, her nerves stretched to the breaking point, delivered the line that has echoed through 5 centuries. She put her hands around her slender throat and laughed a strange, high laugh. "I heard the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." By 8 a.m. the preparations were complete. The gates of the tower were left open, but the general public was kept out. This was to be a spectacle for the eyes of the government, not the mob. About 1,000 people, courtiers, officials, and merchants, crowded around the scaffold erected on Tower Green. The scaffold was low, draped in black. It was not a stage for a queen, it was a stage for a criminal. At shortly before 9 a.m., the doors of the Queen's lodgings opened. Anne Boleyn emerged. If there was ever a moment where Anne Boleyn proved her mettle, it was this walk. A lesser person might have fainted. A weaker person might have screamed. Anne did neither. She walked with the brisk, energetic step that had always defined her. She looked like a woman hurrying to an appointment she did not want to miss. She had dressed with calculated brilliance. She knew the world would be watching, and she knew that visual symbols mattered. She wore a robe of dark gray damask, trimmed with fur. Underneath a petticoat of crimson, the color of the Catholic martyrs, a subtle, ironic visual claim to holiness. She held a prayer book in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those famous dark, witchy eyes, were scanning the crowd. She was looking for friends. She found few. Cromwell was there. Her old lover's father, the Earl of Northumberland, was there. The king's bastard son, Henry Fitzroy, was there, watching the woman who had displaced his mother go to her death. She climbed the stairs of the scaffold. The French executioner, dressed in black, reportedly begged for her forgiveness. She gave it to him, handing him a small purse of gold. Then she turned to the crowd. The speech of a condemned traitor was a highly ritualized genre. You were expected to admit your guilt and warn others not to follow your path. If you deviated, if you claimed innocence too loudly, the king might take revenge on your surviving family. Anne had a daughter, Elizabeth, to protect. She could not afford the luxury of the truth, so she performed a master class of ambiguity. Good Christian people, she began, her voice steady and clear. I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. Notice the phrasing. She does not say, I am guilty. She says she is dying according to the law. She acknowledges the legal reality, not the moral truth. She continued, I come here only to die, and thus to yield myself humbly to the will of the King, my Lord. And if in my life I did ever offend the King's grace, surely with my death I do now atone. And then, the lines that must have tasted like ash in her mouth. I pray God save the King and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. It was a lie so colossal it was almost satire. Henry, gentle and merciful, the man who was murdering her? But it was the lie that saved Elizabeth. By praising Henry, she ensured he would not feel the need to crush her child. She asked for prayers, not for justice. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. She removed her ermine mantle. She took off her headdress. One of her weeping ladies handed her a white linen cap to tuck her hair away. She did not want the blade to catch on a stray lock. In England, victims usually knelt at a block and had to stretch their necks out, waiting for the axe. It was a clumsy, brutal position. But the French style was different. There was no block. The victim knelt upright, back straight, head held high. Anne knelt. Her ladies covered her eyes with a blindfold. The world vanished. All that remained was the sound of the wind in the trees and the murmuring of the crowd. She began to pray, repeating the words over and over frantically. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. The executioner, Jean Rambaud, knew his business. He knew that victims often flinched at the sound of the sword being drawn or turned their heads at the last second, leading to a messy, hacking death. He needed her to be perfectly still. He had left his sword hidden in the straw at the base of the scaffold. He took off his shoes so he could move silently. While Anne was praying, to Jesus Christ, to Jesus Christ, Rambaud motioned to his assistant at the bottom of the steps. "Boy," he shouted suddenly, pointing to the side, "fetch me my sword." Anne, hearing the shout, turned her head slightly toward the sound, thinking the sword was still far away. Her neck was now perfectly positioned. Her mind was distracted. In that split second of distraction, Rimbaud pulled the heavy double-edged blade from the straw, swung it in a wide, silent arc, and struck. It was so fast that some said her lips were still moving when her head hit the straw. The cannon at the tower fired. The boom rolled across the Thames. At the palace, hearing the sound, Henry VIII reportedly looked at his hunting party and said, "The deed is done. Uncouple the hounds, and let us follow the sport." The aftermath was a disgrace. Henry had been so focused on hiring the swordsman that he had forgotten to order a coffin. The body of the Queen of England lay on the blood-soaked scaffold for hours while her ladies wept over it. Finally, someone found an old chest used to store arrows in the Tower armory. It was too short. They had to place Anne's head beside her legs to make her fit. They carried the chest into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a small church within the Tower walls. There were no hymns, no funeral mass. They pried up some flagstones in front of the altar and buried her in a shallow, unmarked grave. She was gone. The next day, Henry VIII betrothed himself to Jane Seymour. 10 days later, they were married. Henry began a campaign of erasure. He ordered Anne's portraits destroyed. He ordered her initials chipped off the stone walls of the palaces. Elizabeth was declared a bastard, stripped of her title, and sent away to the country, ignored by her father. The Boleyn family crumbled. Her father, Thomas, died 2 years later, in disgrace and without honor. The men who orchestrated her death, including Cromwell, eventually met their own grisly ends, leading to whispers of a Boleyn curse. Even in death, Anne was slandered as a six-fingered monster by Catholic propaganda, a myth finally debunked only in 1876, when her bones were exhumed and found to be delicate and perfect. But Henry failed to realize that you cannot bury a spirit like Anne's in an arrow chest. While he grew bloated and tyrannical, haunted by the wreckage of his choices, the bastard daughter he ignored was watching. Elizabeth grew up with her mother's intelligence and her father's fire. She learned the lesson Anne died to teach her: trust no one, keep your own counsel, rule alone. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, she didn't talk much about her mother. It was still too politically sensitive. But she quietly rehabilitated Anne's memory. She adopted her mother's badge, the falcon. She promoted her mother's relatives. And when Elizabeth died in 1603, an old woman who had ruled England for 45 glorious years, they found a ring on her finger. It was a secret locket ring. Inside there were 2 portraits. One was Elizabeth, the other was Anne Boleyn. For nearly half a century, the Virgin Queen had been looking at her mother's face every day. The woman Henry tried to erase had been there, silently guiding the golden age of England. Anne Boleyn had lost her life, but through her daughter she had won history.